Module 3, Analyzing Linguistic Features and Their Function. 3.1, Introduction. Linguistic description is central to all analysis of text varieties for the registers and style perspectives. The focus is on identification of the pervasive lexicogrammatical features that are especially prevalent in a text variety. The key difference between those two perspectives is the interpretation of observed differences. The linguistic patterns are observed associated functional with the situational context in the case of register analysis, and they are associated with aesthetic effects achieved by particular authors speakers in the case of style analysis. The general perspective differs from those other two perspectives in the focus of the linguistic analysis itself. Describing the conventional devices or rhetorical organization used to structure complete text from a variety. As noted in Module 1, our primary focus in the present course is on the register perspective. Previous chapters have introduced the three major steps of registers analysis. First, describing the situational characteristic of the register, including distinctive aspect of the context and communicative purpose. Second, identifying the distinctive linguistic characteristic of the register, and third, showing how the situational and linguistic descriptions are related to one another by interpreting the function that the linguistic features serve. In Module 2, we introduced a framework for describing the situational characteristic. In this module, we introduced the methods for carrying out the second and third steps, the linguistic and functional analysis. One major analytic problem discussed in the module is deciding on the linguistic features to analyze. First, however, the module begins with issues that are even more fundamental. The need for comparative approach, quantitative analysis, and representative samples. With the background, the module then provides specific information about how to conduct quantitative analysis, how to choose the linguistic features to analyze, and how to undertake a functional interpretation that integrates the linguistic and situational descriptions. Later in the module, then, we describe the linguistic analysis of text from the genre and style perspective. In Module 2, we noted that the situational analysis includes consideration of the same basic parameters in the register and genre perspectives. However, we show in sections 3.2.2 and 3.6 that the linguistic analysis focus on quite different considerations in the two perspectives. The style perspective differs from both register and general perspectives. The situational analysis of style is less relevant because writers and speakers are deliberately manipulating linguistic from aesthetic effects regardless of the actual situational context. Similarly, the function analysis of linguistic patterns focused on the aesthetic effect rather than direct communicative functions. See section 3.7. 3.2, Fundamental issues from the linguistic analysis of registers. In general, the goal of the linguistic analysis is to identify the language features that are typical or characteristic of the target register. A basic concern, therefore, is how to determine whether a linguistic feature is typical in a given register. To beginning this discussion, consider text sample 3.1 from a geology textbook. Take a time to read through the text and list any linguistic features, lexical or grammatical, that you suspect might be typical of the textbook register. Text sample 3.1 Geology textbook. The rock of the Jura are fossiliferous limestones. They are famous for fossils of extinct sea creatures called ammonites that live in coiled shells resembling the modern coiled nautilus. In the early 19th century, When European geologists started to arrange fossils in the sequence in which they had lived, fossils in Jura were selected as the types characterizing certain ammonites, and rocks containing ammonites were selected as an example of Jurassic sedimentary rocks named after the Jura Hills. Probably the most noticeable characteristic of this text is the numerous long words. Many of these are technical terms that you might not understand if you aren't a geology major. Fossiliferous ammonites, Jurassic sedimentary. Beyond that, you might have noticed that this short passage has only 3 sentences, and that the third sentence is very long, 50 words. But how do you know whether these features are typical for this register or not? Having read a lot of textbook and other types of writing, you can probably make guesses based on your experience, but can you be sure other analysts would agree with you? Have you simply neglected to notice other more characteristic features? And what if you study a register that you are not very familiar with? Determining what is typical in a register is associated with 3 major methodological considerations in a register analysis. 1. The need for a comparative approach. 2. The need for quantitative analysis. 3. The need for a representative sample of text. In the following subsections, we discuss this consideration. 3.2.1 The need for comparative approach. If you notice the long technical words in the text sample 3.1 and suspected that such vocabulary is typical of textbooks, you were using your general prior experience with all registers as a basis of comparison. That is, you knew that you had rarely, if ever, seen these words before, and so you were able to identify them are rare technical words that could be characteristic of these registers in contrast to other registers. Given that there are several such as in this short paragraph, it was reasonable to hypothesize that the use of technical long words is a general linguistic characteristic of textbook. But what about the linguistic features, for example? How do you know if a 50-word sentence is long? Based on your prior experience with particular register like news reports and novels, this sentence probably seems to be long, but perceptions of this type can be quite personal, and another analyst might come to a different conclusion. This problem becomes even more acute when you consider other more basic linguistic characteristics. For example, is there anything distinctive about the use of nouns or pronouns in text sample 3.1? Is this use typical of textbooks? How do you know that is? How can you offer evidence to support such conclusions? An empirical comparative approach is crucial for providing an adequate basis for answering questions of this type. That is, to identify the distinctive characteristic of the target register, it is necessarily to empirically comparative the language in one register to the language in other registers. So, for example, comparative the language of text sample 3.1 to text sample 3.2 from a novel with the main character K starting a train trip. Text sample 3.2 fictions. They pulled away from the siding and began to move through the backyards of Worcester, where women hung out washing and children stood on fences to wave. The train gradually picking up speed, Kay watched the telegraph wires rise and falls. They passed mile after mile of bare and neglected vineyards, circled over by crows. Then the engine began to labor as they entered the mountains. Kay shivered. He could smell his own sweat through the musty odor of his clothes. They became a halt. A guard unlocked the doors, and the moment they stepped out, the reason for stopping became clear. The train could go no further. The track ahead was covered in a mountain of rocks and red clay that had come pouring down the slope, tearing a wide gash in the hillside. someone made a remark and there was a burst of laughter. First of all, the comparisons support the perception that the words in the textbook sample are long and technical in contrast the longest word in the novel. Gradually mountains are not technical vocabulary and there are many other short, simple words, fences, wave, rise, fall. Furthermore, while the fiction sample has sentences of over 30 words, none of the sentences come near the textbook 50 words sense length, though two passages are also very different in their use of nouns and pronouns. The textbook passage uses the pronouns they twice, once referring to the rocks of the Jura and once to fossils. However, the nouns rocks and fossils are themselves used repeatedly in the fiction passage. In contrast, the noun they is used repeatedly to refer somewhat vaguely to the train passengers, and he and the possessive determine his refer back to K. In larger studies of textbook and fiction, these differences are seen on a wide scale. Textbook have fewer pronouns and more repetition of nouns, while fiction has more use of pronouns. Most people don't notice simple grammatical features such as noun and pronoun. They are pervasive features that are so common that the speaker normally do not even notice their existence. However, linguistic differences of this type are central to register analysis. Such features can occur to some extent in all registers, but they are especially frequent and therefore typical in particular register. To identify registers features of this type, it is necessary to employ a comparative approach that incorporates quantitative techniques covered in section 3.3. 3.2.2 Register features, register markers, markers, style features. The linguistic analysis of a register is based on register features, words or grammatical characteristics that are pervasive, distributed throughout a text from the register, and frequent, occurring more commonly in the target register than in most comparison register. It is important to note that these linguistic features are not exclusively restricted to the target register. For example, passive voice verb was based on our register features and of academic writing, although they are found to some extent in every register. They are much more common in academic writing than in most the registers. In addition, a few registers have distinctive linguistic constructions that do not occur in other registers. These are called register markers. For example, the expression the count in 3 and 2 or it's 3 and 2 and is sliding into second are distinctive register markers of baseball game broadcast. The first expression of describing the pitching situation and the second describing a player trying to get the to second base especially quickly. Because the expression are so fixed, anyone who knows baseball will immediately recognize the register from the presence of this expression. See Ferguson 1983. Describe the appendix A. Sports broadcasts of other kinds will use different formulae. For example, broadcast of American football games will include expressions like it's a third and four, which means it is third down with 4 yards to go for a first down. Although it is similar to baseball, it will never be said as the count, nor will the first number ever be a cardinal number rather than an original number. You will never hear. You will never hear. It's 3 and 4 in a football game broadcast. Thus, even within sports broadcast, the formulae that function as register markers are highly distinctive. Similar to register features, register markers are common and pervasive in the target register. The differences between the two is that register markers are not normally found in other registers. In fact, if a speaker uses a register markers in another situation, they are usually invoking the associated register. For example, if your friend suddenly says the count is 0 or O and 2 in the middle of a conversation, she is somehow invoking a baseball game setting. maybe figuratively saying that you have already made two mistakes and can only make one another before you are out. Genre markers should be distinguished from both register features and register markers. Markers are the distinctive expressions and devices that are used to structure a text from a particular genre. Genre markers are not pervasive, rather, they normally occur only one time in a text. As such, they are also not frequent, but they are distinctive, normally being formulaic and occurring in only a particular location of a text from a particular genre, often at the beginning or end of the text. For example, business letters normally begin with a genre marker like Dear Sir. Religious speech events are often highly structured as genres. For example, a Christian prayer begins with a genre marker like in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and ends with the genre marker Amen. Legal trials are also highly structured as genres, with fixed genre markers being used at particular locations in the speech event for particular subgenres. All rise, have you reached a verdict? We find the defendant. Other kinds of texts are less highly structured but still often have genre markers. For example, an email message can begin with various genre markers depending on the relationship between the senders and the receivers. Dear Dr. Conrad or Hi Susan. Similarly, there are several genre markers that could be used to end an email message. Best wishes, sincerely, talk to you later, since the purposes and other contextual factors of email, messages, and letters are closely related. These genre markers may be shared by two genres. Classroom teaching sessions are also less strictly structured as genres, but they can begin with a genre marker like okay, let's get started, and end with a genre markers like okay, see you on Wednesday. Finally, style features are similar to register features in beginning pervasive and frequent, distributed throughout text that represent the style and occurring more commonly in the style than in other comparison style as described in Module 1. The main difference between the two is that register features are functionally while style features are preferred for aesthetic reasons. See section 3.7. The key differences among register features, register markers, genre markers, and style features parallel. The differences among the register, genre, and style analytic perspectives described in Module 1, Table 3.1 summarizes the differences. Table 3.1 defining characteristic of register features, register markers, genre markers, and style features. Type of linguistic characteristics are register features, register markers, genre marker, style feature. Complete text or text examples of register features, text samples, or complete text if short. Distribution of the characteristic of register features pervasive. Frequencies of characteristic in a particular variety compared to other varieties of register feature more frequent. Use of the characteristic in other varieties of register feature occur in other varieties but less commonly. Characteristic functional or arbitrary conventional of register feature functional. Complete text or text samples of register marker, text samples or complete text if short. Distribution, the characteristic or distribution of the characteristic of register marker pervasive. Frequency of characteristic in a particular variety compared to other varieties register marker more frequent. Use of the characteristic in other varieties of register marker does not normally occur in other varieties. Characteristic functional or arbitrary conventional of register markers, formulaic and arbitrary conventional, usually not functional. Complete text or text samples of genre marker, complete text. Distribution of the characteristic genre marker often occur only once at particular location in the text. Frequency of characteristic in a particular variety compared to other varieties of genre marker often occur only once so not very common. Use of the characteristic in other varieties of genera marker usually does not occur in other varieties, may occur in closely related genres. Characteristic functional or arbitrary conventional of genera marker formulate an arbitrary conventional, usually not functional. Complete text or text samples of a style feature, text sample or complete text if short. Distribution of the characteristic of a style feature pervasive. Frequency of characteristic in a particular variety compared to other varieties of a style feature more frequent. Use of characteristic in other varieties of a style feature occur in other varieties but less commonly. Characteristic functional or arbitrary conventional of a style feature preferred for aesthetic value, usually not functional. In 3.2.3, the need for quantitative analysis. If all registers had register markers, identification of register would be an easy task. You would simply look for those distinctive marker. Unfortunately, register markers are rare. Most registers cannot be identified by the occurrence of a distinctive register marker. Instead, analysts must rely on register features that are pervasive and frequent in a register. Analysis of register features requires consideration of the extent to which a linguistic structure is used. Register features come from all linguistic levels: words, grammatical classes, syntactic constructions, etc. The key point about register features is that the focus is on extent to which the feature is used. That is, the linguistic feature in question might occur to some extent in most, maybe all registers, but it all notably frequent in only some registers and comparatively rare in other registers. The distributional differences in what makes the word or grammatical structure a register feature. As noted in 3.2.1, determining whether a feature is frequent or rare requires a comparative approach. An analyst cannot legitimately claim that a feature is frequent in a register until she has observed the less frequent use of the same feature in other registers. But this also requires a quantitative approach. An analyst cannot legitimately claim that a feature is more frequent in one register than another unless he has counted the occurrences of the features in each register. Since most people notice unusual characteristic more than common ones, simply relying on what you notice if a register is not reliable way to identify register features. An additional advantage of using the comparative quantitative approach is that it enables the investigation of linguistic features that might otherwise go unnoticed, as exemplified with nouns and pronouns in section 3.2.1. As a further example, with these words classes, compare text samples 3.3 and 3.4. Text samples 3.3 repeats the geology textbook excerpt from text sample 3.1, and text 3.4 is part of graduate level rhetoric class. Text sample 3.3 geology textbook. Noun are underlined and pronoun are in bold italics. The rock of the Jura are fossil limestones. They are famous for fossils of extinct sea creatures called ammonites that live in coiled shells resembling the modern coiled nautilus. In the early 19th century, when European geologists started to arrange fossils in the sequence in which they had lived, fossils in the Jura were selected as the types characterizing certain ammonites, and rocks containing ammonites were selected as the examples of Jurassic sedimentary rocks named after the Jura Hills. The noun are underlined are rock, Jura limestone, fossils, sea creatures, ammonites, shells, nautilus, century, geologist, fossils, sequence, fossils, Jura, types, ammonites, rocks, ammonites, Examples, Rock and Jura Hills. The pronoun are they. Text sample 3.4 graduate level rhetoric class. Noun are underlined and pronoun are in bold italics. Instructor. Alright, the other two things that I would like to do today, as I mentioned, are talk about some themes that have emerged in the class. Uh, and I do want you to write a final essay and we can negotiate that entirely, but basically what I want you to do is to connect up some stands. You connect up readings and other things we've discussed with those stands. And I thought that we might just talk a little bit today about potential things that you found useful or found interesting in what we've been doing. And I've got some possibilities, but I'd rather have you guys start as of with this relevant to that maybe also project that you are working on, and I would like to get a quick read before we leave so the other here will have a feel for where you're headed, because we do not two new projects going. These are the noun, things, themes, class, essay, strands, readings, things, strand, bit, things, possibilities, guys, projects, read, others, feel, and projects. The pronouns are I, we, that, you, we've, this, and we. Few readers immediately think of the use of noun as register figures because all texts use noun to some extent, as this passage illustrates. However, there is a noteworthy difference in the distribution of nouns and pronouns in these two registers. Noun are much more common than pronoun in the textbook passage, 23 nouns versus only 2 pronouns. In contrast, pronouns are more common than noun is the classroom teaching text, 17 nouns versus 24 pronouns. This difference is even stronger than it seemed because the classroom teaching excerpt is much longer than the textbook excerpt. Thus, there is less opportunity to use nouns in the shorter passage. We return to this topic in section 3.3, which explains how to compute actual rates of occurrence for such distribution. 3.2.4, the need for representative samples. Finally, to identify the typical linguistic characteristic of a register, it is necessary to have a representative sample of text. To understand this issue, consider one extreme example of not having a representative samples. Imagine the result that you would get if you get out to analyze the register of fiction writing, but the only novel you had was Watership Down, a story which revolves around a group of rabbits. When you consider the vocabulary, you would find the rabbit and rabbits were very common, as well as are replaced in the story called the Great Barrow. But it would of not be fair to generalize and say that the fiction writing has a high frequency of the word rabbit and the phrase get barrow, the Great Barrow. And while grammatical features generally vary less across texts than vocabulary does, the point of this example applies for all registers analysis. You cannot generalize to a whole register from a text or a small number of them. A representative sample of text will capture the range of linguistic variation that exists in the register, which a majority of the text having the linguistic characteristics that are typically of the register. Several considerations are important. Diversity in writers or speakers is necessary so that the style of single individual does not unduly affect the results, unless you are studying the literary style of an individual author. If you are analyzing a register that has more specialized subregisters within it, text from all the subregisters must have included in your sample. For example, if you were trying to characterize the language used in the news. You would need not only news reports but also editorial sports articles, reviews, etc. If the text from a register are normally short, such as text messages, you should include whole text in your sample, but for registers with long text, such as novels, it is acceptable to take excerpts from the whole text. All excerpts must be long enough to provide reliable counts of features. In addition, if there are sections of longer text that have different communicative purposes, such as research article sections, you must include excerpts from each of the sections. Exactly how much different texts are enough, and exactly how long do texts need to be. Unfortunately, there are no clear-cut answer to these questions. Some linguistic features are extremely common, pervasive in text like nouns, pronouns, or verbs. For those features, you can compute reliable counts from a few texts that are relatively short. Even 100-word text excerpts, other features like relative clauses are less common. To reliable capture the distribution of those features in array registers, you would need longer text and a larger sample of text. See Biber 1990-1993 for fuller discussion of these issues. Compiling a representative sample of text from a register can be a difficult task. Analyzing numerous linguistic features in a large number of texts is an even more daunting task. In fact, a comprehensive register analysis is unfeasible without computer assistance. Many of the larger studies that you read about in the course have used the tool of corpus linguistic to study registers. This methodological approach involves using a principled collection of texts that are stored on a computer, the corpus, and using computer-assisted techniques for the analysis. Section 3.9 provides a fuller introduction to this approach. Given the importance of a representative sample of text for describing a register, you may wonder if there is any point in doing an analysis with a small number of texts. Our answer is yes. And in fact, you will be asked to do several small case studies throughout this course. In the last section of this module, we will have more to say about small-scale and large-scale registers analysis are used in this course. The most important point to always remember, however, is to not overgeneralize from analysis that are based on few texts. 3.3 Conducting quantitative linguistic analysis. In essence, quantitative register analysis requires simply that the analysts count how many times a linguistic features occur in a text. However, the major difficulty has nothing to do with numbers. Rather, the difficult part is the prerequisite to categorizing all the linguistic features consistently. That is, before counting, it is essential to consistently and accurately identify every occurrence of the linguistic features in questions. 3.3.1 Classifying linguistic features in principled and consistent way. Principled consistent clarification of language features can be a surprisingly difficult task. Most people learn grammar from textbooks that have easy, clear-cut examples, but natural text from different register almost always contain linguistic forms that do not fit tidily into the textbook categories. In such cases, the register analyst should note the construction, make a principled decision about how to categorize forms of this type, and systematically apply that decision to all similar cases. This is an important point. Register analysis something spent countless hours agonizing over decisions about how classify a construction until they find the correct answer, but they experience a new round of doubt when they encounter a slight different occurrence of the linguistic construction. In many of these cases, there is no single correct analysis. Rather, you should simply decide on a reasonable analysis that you can justify, and then apply that analysis systematically to all other relevant cases. If the feature has been discussed in previous studies, you can refer to the decisions made in those studies as evidence for your analysis. However, the main consideration are that you document your analytical decisions, give reasonable justifications for them, and then consistently apply the same coding to all texts that you analyze. The two short text excerpts in text samples 3.3 and 3.4 provide several interesting examples of cases where principled consistent decision must be made. One of them involves the analysis of words that appear before a head noun functioning as a noun modifier, as in big dog. Some traditional grammar books classify all of these words as adjective. The text samples about provide several clear examples of adjectives premodifying a head noun, as in fossiliferous is the noun, limestone, extinct is the noun, creatures, a lethal is the noun, bit. There are two main reasons why this word should be analyzed as adjective. They can occur before noun and they can also occur after the verb be. Thus, compare the example about to the following. The rock is fossiliferous is the noun. They are extinct is the noun. It was little. Little is a noun. They are gradable in meaning, and can be modified by an adverb. For example, highly fossiliferous, completely extinct, very little. The coding issue here arises because there are other structures in this text that appear to be similar because they function as a premodifier of a head noun, see creatures. However, these other structures are instances of a noun rather than an adjective occurring as premodifier of another noun. This analysis can be justified by checking whether these other words behave more like noun or adjectives. On the one hand, these forms do not pass either of the two tests for adjectives. They cannot occur after the verb be, the views was see, and they cannot be modified by a gradable adverb very see. On the other hand, they do behave like nouns. The word see can occur as the head of a noun phrase and it can be modified by adjective, the deep blue sea. Based on these factors, we would count C as noun and make a distinction between adjective modifying a head noun, extinct creatures, and noun modifying a head noun, sea creature. Jura is a second example in sample 3.3 of a noun occurring as pre-modifier of a head noun, Jura Hills. A second case study illustrating the need for consistent grammatical coding comes from the analysis of the words read and feel in the phrases get a quick read and have a feel for at the end of the text, sample 3.4. Your initial reaction might be to think of words like read and feel as verbs, but many words in English can function as either a verb or as a noun. Words like need, desire, hope, use, work, play, run, walk, catch. When they are the head of a noun phrase, this word can take a determiner, a or the and be modified by adjectives but not adverb. Thus, we classify them as noun rather than verbs in the grammatical context. Working with transcribed speech often involves other complex methodological decisions. For example, suppose you had planned to compare sentence length in text sample 3.3 and 3.4. Punctuation has been added by the transcriber in text sample 3.4. The speaker used intonation and pauses together with hesitation markers like and to break up the text into smaller units. So transcribe added dashes, commas, and full stops to reflect this process and falling tones, but it is not clear which of these units correspond to sentences in a written text. For example, the first dash in the excerpt might be interpreted as separating two sentences. Themes that have emerged in the class "oh" and "I do want." In contrast, other use of occur when the speaker is adding a clarification phrase and clearly not beginning a new sentence. But I'd rather have you guys all start us off with this all relevant to that maybe. Similarly, a full stop is sometimes used to separate structures that would not be regarded as complete sentences in writing. So the other here will have a feel for where you're headed cause we do not do new projects going. In fact, the notion of sentence is quite controversial in speech. As a result, you would probably be unable to find a meaningful basis for comparing sentence length between this spoken and written text. Faced with the methodological problem, you could instead change your focus with sentences which are based on punctuation to clauses which are based on grammatical structure. You can make principle justifiable and consistent decision for identifying clauses and still explaining important contrast between the text. For example, there is a notable difference in the way that clauses are connected in the two texts as will be discussed in section 3.5. You might think that controversies about classifying linguistic features are unusual. In fact, you will be required to make operational decision of this type nearly every time you undertake a quantitative linguistic analysis of text. Two general points are especially helpful to keep in mind as you begin to conduct register analysis. First, there is no escaping grammatical analysis even for a task as simple as counting the number of nouns in a text. For the reason many register analysts find it useful to have a comprehensive reference grammar to aid their analysis. Second, there is sometimes no single correct grammatical analysis. You need to consider the alternative and decide on an analysis which seems the most appropriate and has the strongest justification in your eyes. The most important consideration are that you make an explicit decision, that you can justify that decision, that you clearly document your decision, and that you can then apply the decision consistently to all relevant cases. 3.3.2 Computing rates of occurrence frequencies counts. At the outset, we said that the main point of the present section 3.3 was to introduce the methods to quantitative analysis, but we have not even mentioned quantitative counts yet. This is because numeric counts are usually useless if they are not based on careful linguistic analysis. The quantitative approach forces the analyst to be explicit and comprehensive about the linguistic methods when writing up the result of our register study. This requirement should always result in a separate methods section or appendix which provides details of the linguistic analysis of operational definitions for all coding decisions and discussions of how problematic cases were treated. But we are now ready to move on the counts themselves. Let returns to the distribution of nouns and pronouns in text. Sample 3.3 and 3.4 frequencies counts are shown in table 3.2. A quick look at these results suggests that nouns are more frequent in the textbooks than in the lecture, although the difference does not seem to be large. In contrast, there is a large difference for pronouns, which are much more frequent in the lecture than the textbook. Table 3.2 counts of nouns and pronouns in text. Sample 3.3 and 3.4. Text sample 3.3 textbook. Number of nouns is 23. Number of pronouns is 2. Text sample 3.4 lecture. The number of nouns is 17, the number of nouns is 24. However, there is a methodological problem with this count because the two texts are different in length. The text passage is much shorter than the lecture, 79 words in the textbook's passage versus 157 words in the lecture passage. As a result, the linguistic feature has more opportunity to occur in the lecture passage. There might be higher counts in the lecture passage just because it is longer. To compensate for this problem, it is important to compute a normed rate of occurrence. The rate at which feature occurs is in a fixed amount of text. This is a sample formula for such conventions. Normed rate, row count, total word count, the fixed amount of text. For example, the row count above can be converted to rates per 100 words of text. In the case of nouns in the textbook passage, the formula would work as follows. Norm rate, the pronoun in the textbook per 100 words of text. 23 nouns, 79 words total. 100 words equals to 29.1 nouns per 100 words. This same procedure can be followed to normalize the counts for all features. Normed rate for nouns in the lecture per 100 words of text. 17 nouns, 157 words total. 100 words equals to 10.8 nouns per 100 words. Normed rate for pronouns in the textbook per 100 words of text. Two pronouns, 79 words total, 100 words equals to 2.5 pronouns per 100 words. Norm rate for pronouns in the lecture per 100 words of text, 24 pronouns, 157 words total, 100 words equals to 15.3 pronouns per 100 words. Basing quantitative comparison on norm rates of occurrence allows consideration of the actual extent to which a feature is used, and this can often reveal patterns that are quite different from what an analyst might have believed if the analysis has been based on row counts. For example, compare the patterns in table 3.3 to the row counts in table 3.2. We earlier observed that the row counts for nouns were almost equally common in the two passages, but it is apparent from the norm rates that nouns have a much higher rate of occurrence in the textbook passage than in the lecture. In fact, almost 3 times as common. In contrast, the apparent difference between the two texts in the use of pronouns has been reduced somewhat, although the norm rates still show dramatical differences for this feature. Table 3.3, norm rates of occurrence for nouns and pronouns in text sample 3.3 and 3.4. Text sample 3.3 textbook, nouns per 100 words is 29.1. Pronouns per 100 words is 2.5. Text sample 3.4 lecture, nouns per 100 words is 10.8. Pronouns per 100 words 15.3. You might have noticed that we have so far glossed over yet another methodological decision, what to count as a word in determining the total word count of a text. This is especially an issue when comparing spoken and written text. For example, should contractions with I'm dot be counted as one word or two? Should field post be counted as words or excluded from the total word count? In the present case, we decided to use orthographic words and so treated contracted forms as a single word rather than two words. We decided to exclude field poses from the total words count since these forms have no lexical content or grammatical function. But as with the discussion in the last section, the most important consideration such as decision is that you are able to justify them and that you apply them consistently across all texts in the analysis. 3.4 Deciding on the linguistic features to investigate. There is no easy way to decide ahead of time which linguistic features to investigate for a register analysis because almost any linguistic feature can have functional associations and be useful for distinguishing among registers. What we offer in this section is a list of features that you might consider. Consulting a corpus-based reference grammar is useful for deciding which lexical and grammatical features to study. We are, for obvious reasons, most familiar with the Longman Grammar of Spoken and Written English (LGSWE) by Burke et al. 1999. Like a traditional grammar, the LGSWE provides a full description as the grammatical categories and structures in English. However, LGSWE also provides information about the use of grammatical features in the four different registers: conversation, fiction, newspaper writing, and academic prose. Based on empirical analysis, understanding how grammatical features are used in these four general registers can help you decide which linguistic features to focus on in your studies of other registers. In addition, there have there have been numerous research studies that explore the use of different linguistic features in different registers. See Appendix A. One approach would be to focus your register analysis on a particular aspect of language use and compare that aspect across registers. For example, you might focus on nouns and pronouns used as referring expressions and count all the linguistic features that can be used to refer to entries: nouns, personal pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, etc. You can then see how different registers use the linguistic resources that are available for referring to things and people. Another more common approach is to include several different kinds of linguistic features. Table 3.4 provides a list of linguistic characteristics that have been shown to be useful register features in previous study. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but it should give you some ideas for features to consider in your own register analysis. Table 3.4: linguistic features that might be investigated in a register's analysis. 1. Vocabulary features: the use of a specific multifunctional word, have, make. List of the common words in different registers. Specialized words, legal terms. Vocabulary distributions: type, token, ratio, the number of the different words, total words usually in the first 100 or 1000 words. Average word length. Number of once occurring words. Number 2, content word classes. Noun, salary, institution. Verb, emerge or eat. Adjectives, external and clear. Adverb, quickly, fast. Functional word classes. Determiners, articles, a, the. Demonstratives, this, that, this, those. Pronouns, see 6 below. Proverb, do. Modal verb, might, could, can, will. Prepositions, see 8 below. Coordinator, and or but. Discourse markers, well, okay, alright. Vocatives and attention getters. Hey, Karen, honey. Expletives, dumb. Number 4, derived words. Nominalizations, realizations, development. Derived verb, dislike, simplify, itemize. Derived adjectives, functional, attractive. Derived adverbs, repeatedly, happily. Conversion, walk, a walk. Verb features. Verb valencies, intransitive, detransitive, etc. Copular verb, be, become, get, go, as in I got tired. Phrasal verbs, look out, turn off. Tense, present or past. Aspect, simple, he walks. Progressive, he is walking. Perfect, he has walk. Voice, active. She used a computer, passive. In table 3.4, count. Agentless passive, a computer was used for the analysis. By passive, a computer was used by the research team for the analysis. Modal verb classes. Possibility, can, could, might, may. Necessity, must, should. Predictive, will, would, shall. Semi-modal verbs, have to, ought to. Semantic classes of verb. Active, play, meet, put, show, live. Communication, say, tell, report, claim. Mental, think, guess, aspect. Desire, want, wish, need. Action verb with inanimate subjects. This study demonstrate. Number 6, pronoun features. Person. First, I, we, me, us. Second, you. Third, he, she, they, him, her, them. Pronoun, it. Demonstrative pronoun, this, that, this, those. Indefinite pronouns. Anybody, nothing. 7. Reduced forms and dispreferred structures. Contractions. I'm, they, can't. Complementizer. That deletion. I think he went. Relative pronoun deletion. The dog I saw at the park. Other kinds of ellipses and incomplete sentence. Want more? Stranded prepositions. The place I was thinking of. Number 8. Prepositional praise. Of praises versus other prepositions of, to, for, with. Functioning as adverbial. They stayed in town after the storm. Functioning as noun modifier. The post office in town is new. Number 9, coordination. Independent close coordination. It was my birthday and I was excited. Praisal coordination. The paper is interesting and innovative. Number 10, main clause type. Declarative, interrogative. Yes, no questions. Did you shut the door? WH questions. Who shut the door? Tag questions. You shut the door, didn't you? Imperative. Shut the door. Average clause or sentence length. 11. Noun phrases. Semantic category of noun. Animate noun. Teacher, child, person. Cognitive noun. Fact, knowledge. Table 3.4 count. Concrete noun. Rain, dirt, house. Group, institution, noun. Committee, congress. Process noun. Application, meeting. Determiner or article used. Definite articles, indefinite articles, zero articles, demonstrative determiners. Nominal premodifiers. Attributive adjective, big house. Participles, flashing lights. Noun, airport security measures. Nominal post modifier, restrictive versus non-restrictive relative clauses. That relative clauses, people that we know. WH relative clause, the guy who started the fire. Past participial clauses, the result summarized below. Present participial clauses, a society consisting of educated people. The relative clauses, the person to see. Prepositional phrases, a school for disabled children. A positive noun phrases. Mark Olive appeals attorney for Tafero. Multiple post modifier. Gender reference, chairperson versus chairman. Dual gender reference, he or she. Noun complement clauses. That clause, the fact that, to clauses, the proposal to. Of plus in clauses. Risk of failing. Of plus WH clauses. The problem of how to. Number 12. Adverbials. Major type. Circumstances quickly in the afternoon. Stance, possibly, unfortunately. Linking, however, so. Syntactic realization. Single adverb, obviously. Prepositional phrase, in the park. Finite clause, because he couldn't come. Non-finite clause, to begin the story. Syntactic position, initial, medial, final. Circumstances, adverbial types. Place, over there, to the store. Time, then, after, dinner. Manner, quickly. extent, degree, just, only, etc. Instance adverbial types, doubt, maybe, possibly, certainly, obviously, of course, certainly, source of knowledge, according to, attitudes, surprisingly, importantly, adverbial clause types, temporal. After she went back to work, causative, because he could not be sure, conditional, if they made it back, concession, although they tried all night, purpose, they stopped working to have a little rest. Number 13, complement clauses, major type, that close, I think that he already went, too close, I want to go, WH close, I don't know why he did that, ing close, she doesn't like reading those articles, syntactic role, controlled by a verb, mental verbs, I think it's Monday, communication verb, Bob said it's Monday, desire verb, I want you to finish it by Monday, etc. Controlled by an adjective, I was surprised that you could finish it, controlled by a noun, the fact that you could finish it. 14. Word order choices. Extrapositions. It is amazing that racing they are hard to get and they seems to know everything. Parti- Particle placement. You should look that word up. Indirect object replacement. Give the book to Sam versus give Sam the book. By passive versus active. Sally was shocked by the news versus the news shocked Sally. Cleft and focus devices. It was in April of that year that Settled had finally awakened to the possibility. Number 15. Special features of conversation. Back channels and simple responses. Okay, coordinating tags and stuff and things like that. General vague words. Thing, stuff. Poses, silence and fillers. Repetitions. Greetings, attention, getter. Greetings, attention getters. How many features you analyze will depend on practical consideration and the focus of your study. If you are counting features by hand, you will not be able to include as many as if you have computer programs to assist you with the analysis. Furthermore, if you are counting by hand, it is extremely time consuming to count a feature that occur very frequently or a large number of features in a large number of texts. When our students do small scale registers analysis, we generally ask them to count 10 to 15 features if a few texts. In comparison, you will read in later chapters about corpus-based analysis that use over 100 linguistic features in the analysis of 100 of texts. 3.5 Functional interpretations. The final steps in a register analysis, the functional interpretation moves from description to an account of why these patterns exist. The descriptive facts on both sides, situational and linguistic, will already be clearly documented. On the one side, you will have described distinctive situational characteristic of the target register in comparison to other register, and on the other side you will have described distinctive linguistic characteristic. The task now is to match the two up of explaining which particular linguistic characteristic are associated with situational characteristic. This step is interpretive. You must explain why these linguistic features are especially common in the situational context, illustrating your interpretations with convincing examples. To take a specific example, consider again the textbooks and classroom teaching text discussed earlier in this module, text sample 3.3 and 3.4. From a situational perspective, these two registers differ in several key respects which are summarized in table 3.5. Table 3.6 provides a quantitative comparison for several linguistic features for those two text samples. Text samples 3.3 and 3.4. Of course, it would not be appropriate to generalize to the registers from this single text. However, we have selected this particular text because they illustrate the linguistic patterns found in previous large-scale analysis of these registers. By relating the information in tables 3.5 and 3.6, it is possible to begin to formulate functional explanation for the linguistic differences. For example, pronouns have several specific functions, but they all generally refer to something that the listener is already familiar with. In many cases, pronouns refers to the things that are present in the communication situations. Oneself, the listener, other people, or objective objects. Such people and object exist in the situational context for classroom teaching, but not for a textbook. Or at least the author and the reader would not be seeing the same objects. Although the pronouns you, I, and we can be used in textbook to refer to the author and the reader. The higher frequency in the classroom reflect the use of this pronoun is referring to interactions in the classroom. For example, table 3.5 key situational differences between textbook and classroom teaching. Participants, textbook. A textbook of participants, an author addressing an unenumerated number of readers. Classroom teaching of participants, an instructor addressing relatively few students. Textbooks of relations among participants, no interaction, author has more knowledge, all participants have some specialist knowledge, no personal relation. Classroom teaching of relations among participants, interaction is possible, instructor has more knowledge. All participants have some specialist knowledge. Instructor knows students. Textbook of channel, written. Classroom teaching of channel is spoken. Textbook of production circumstances. Text has been carefully planned, revised, and edited. Unknown. Classroom teaching. Text has been planned but it cannot be revised or edited. Speakers and addressees are physical together in a classroom. Textbook of communicative purposes. Convey information, explain concept or methods. Classroom teaching of communicative purposes. Convey information, explain concept or methods, convey personal attitudes, directive, tell students what they should do. Table 3.6 normed rates of occurrence per 100 words for selected linguistic features in text sample 3.3 and 3.4. Linguistic features. Pronoun, nouns, mental or desired verb, feel, want, believe, close initial and but, finite relative clauses, non-finite relative clauses. Text 3.3 textbook of pronoun 2.5. Text 3.4 lecture of pronoun 15.3. Text 3.3 textbook nouns 29.1. Text 3.4 lecture 10.8. Text 3.3 textbook mental desire verb feel, want, believe 0. Text 3.4 lecture 4.5. Close initial text 3.3 textbook close initial and but 1.3. Text 3.4 lecture of close initial and but 4.5. Text 3.3 textbook finite relative clauses 2.5. Text 3.4 lectures of finite relative clauses 3.2. Text 3.3 textbook of non-finite relative clauses 6.3. Text 3.4 lecture of non-finite relative clauses 0. I thought that we might just talk a little bit today about potential things that you found useful or found interesting in what we've been doing. In other cases, speakers in classroom teaching use pronouns because they assume that the listeners will know what they are referring to, comforted by the fact that the listener can always ask for clarification. For example, the instructor's use of that in the discussion of the final essay in text sample 3.4 may not be entirely clear. And I do want to, and I do want you to write a final essay. And we can negotiate that entirely. But basically, what I want you to do is to connect up some strands. What exactly is the instructor saying that we can negotiate? Is the essay itself negotiable, or how to connect strands, or which strands to connect? Presumably, If the reference is not clear for students, they can ask. In contrast, there is no opportunity to ask for clarification when reading a textbook, so authors try to use fuller noun phrases in an attempt to be ambiguously clear. We noted above that the classroom teacher have several purposes: informational, explaining concept; personal, conveying their own opinion and attitudes; and directive, telling students what they should do. The characteristic is reflected in the frequent use of mental and desired verb. In classroom teaching, these verbs are typically used together with first or second person pronouns expressing the instructor personal attitudes and desires. For example, the other two things that I would like to do today, what I want you to do is, I thought that we might just talk a little bit today about. These personal desires serve as directives. What I want to what I want you to do as organizers from the content of the day to introduce topic. But because the interaction takes place in a face-to-face interactive setting, the forms that the instructor uses also function to convey his personal attitudes. Because textbooks are more exclusively focused on conveying information, such constructions rarely occur. In an early corpus-based study of classroom teaching, we failed to fully appreciate the importance of conveying personalized stance as one of the major communicative purposes of classroom teaching at the university level. See by Conrad Reppen et al. 2002. Initially, we defined conveying information as the major communicative purposes of classroom teaching, with conveying personal attitudes as a much less important secondary purpose. We subsequently carried uh, carried out a linguistic analysis of a large corpus of classroom teaching, including hundreds of texts. While doing the linguistic analysis, we discovered that teachers make extensive use of lexical and grammatical devices to express their own stance, personal attitudes, opinions, and assessments of certainty. In fact, these devices were used as frequently as they are in face-to-face conversation. As a result, the linguistic analysis forced use to consider our situational analysis, recording that the expression of personal stance is as important as information content for classroom instructors, and that it is often intertwined with conveying context or giving instructions. This important methodological point was mentioned in Module 2, but it is worth re-emphasizing. It is normal to revise your situational analysis during the process of carrying out the linguistic analysis. That is the process of carefully reading text from the register required for the linguistic analysis and discovering surprising linguistic patterns. The result of quantitative analysis can cause you to re-evaluate your situational analysis. For speakers and writers, the situational context is primary. It defines the register, but the register's analysis, the situational description does not necessarily need to be considered finalized before undertaking the linguistic description. Returning the functional interpretation of Table 3.6, it is also important to note that there are several features that relates to the different way in which clauses are constructed and connected in the two text. Clauses are relatively short in classroom teaching, and they have a looser syntactic structure. One measure of this is the high frequency of close initial and but, often co-occurring with fillers such as and for example, and I do want you to write a final essay, and we can negotiate that entirely, but basically what I want you to do is, in contrast, the textbook has only one close connector, the coordinator, and connecting two clauses. Fossils in the Jura were selected as the types characterizing certain ammonites, and rocks containing ammonites were selected. The textbook has one extremely long sentence rather than a series of short clauses, and uses a logical progression of ideas rather than coordinator to connect clause and sentence. These linguistic differences can be related to the differing production circumstances of these two registers. Classroom teaching is produced in real time so that instructor does not have time to construct complex structures, instead connecting ideas and clauses with simple forms. In many cases, as in the example above, it makes more sense to describe the classroom discourse as a string of utterances joined with the connectors. In contrast, textbook writers have extensive time to construct long, complicated sentences. The opportunity for careful production in writing also result in other more complex structures, such as complex noun phrases. The frequent use of past and present participial clauses is one reflection of these factors. These clauses are used to pack more information into noun phrases with fewer words than infinite relative clauses, as in see creatures called ammonites, coiled shells resembling the modern coiled nautilus, the types characterizing certain ammonites, rocks containing ammonites, example of Jurassic sedimentary rocks named after the Jura Hills. These are complex syntactic constructions difficult to produce in real-time situations, but well suited to the focused informational purposes of textbooks. Thus, these features are much more common in textbooks than classroom teaching. For many students, making functional interpretations is the most difficult part of a register analysis. There is no trick to knowing the best interpretation for the registers you are studying, although the more knowledge you have from previous studies, the easier it usually is to interpret functions in news text. Chapters 4 to 8 will provide numerous examples of relationship between linguistic forms and functions. Table 3.7 lists several of the major functions that are relevant for distinguishing among registers and selected linguistic features that previous study have found to be associated with the informations along. Table 3.7 major function that distinguish among readers and selected linguistic features associated with each function. Major function: interactivity, personal instance, referring to the time and place of communication, referring to shared personal knowledge, referring to shared expert or professional knowledge. Selected linguistic features often associated with the function of interactive questions, first and second person pronouns. Selected linguistic features often associated with the function of personal instance, possibilities, adverbs, personal pronoun plus mental or desired verb, I think that. Selected linguistic features of associated with the function of referring to the time and place of communication, here, there, yesterday, last week, demonstrative pronouns. Selected linguistic features often associated with the functions of referring to shared personal knowledge. Pronouns, first names of friends, vague references, think. Selected linguistic features often associated with the function of referring to shared expert or professional knowledge, technical words and phrases, references to published research study. In general communicative purposes, narrative, past tense verbs, place and times, adverbs, third persons pronouns. Description, adjectives, adverbs, stative verbs, be, seem, appear, look. Directive, imperatives, obligation, modals, should, have to, desire, verbs, with you. I want you to. Procedural, how to. Ordinal numerals, first, second. Imperatives, explanatory or expository. Nouns, relative, close, attributive, adjectives. Presentation of information, elaborating information, adverbial clauses, relative clauses. Condensing information, noun sequences, prepositional phrases instead of subordinate clauses, past and present participial clauses instead of full relative clauses. Marking relations, linking adverbials. For example, however, thus, finite adverbial clauses. Because if, although. Production circumstances, real time, vague nouns, think, head, hedges, sort of, pronouns, contractions, ellipses, repairs, incomplete utterances, careful production and revision, complex noun phrase, complete sentence. With any background you have from other functional analysis you have read should provide you with a starting point for undertaking the functional interpretations. Most importantly, however, consider your own data, interpret functions of the linguistic features in the text that you are studying and relate them to the situational characteristic that you found to be important in the register. Providing illustrative examples to support your interpretation, in sum, we have shown in this section how the functional interpretation can proceed in large part inductively. Once the situational and linguistic analysis are completed, the functional analysis involves matching up characteristic of the two. It is also important to really realize that several linguistic features will usually have a common functional interpretation. Similarly, several different situational characteristics can be associated with a single linguistic characteristic. Do not expect a one-to-one correspondence between a linguistic features and more situational characteristic. Finally, concerning the final written report of a register analysis, there is an additional useful point to keep in mind. It is unlike that you will discuss all of the situational characteristic and linguistic features that you analyze space constraints as well as the attention span of your audience may dictate that you drop discussion of some points that are less interesting. As with all writing, we suggest that you cover the largest and most important point first and then cover more peripheral points as appropriate with your research goals. 3.6 Textual Convention, the general perspective. As described in Module 1 in Section 3.2.2, the general perspective on textual variation difference from the register's perspective by its focus on complete text and the text conventions that are expected in the text of a given genre. While register features are frequent and pervasive in text, textual conventions associated with general perspective are not pervasive. In fact, they often occur only once in a text, and thus it is necessary to consider complete text to identify their existence. Although the register and genre perspectives analyze different types of language features, it is often useful to add an analysis of genre features when undertaking a register analysis in order to describe the text variety more fully. Module 1 presented the example of business letters, which usually begins with a series of textual conventions, the date, the name, and the address of recipients, and then an opening salutations, the dear. These letters also end with a politeness expression, sincerely or best wishes, followed by the name and signature of the writer. These features are not pervasive linguistic features. They are not register features. However, they are clear signal of the type of the text, and they frame the main body of the letter. For a thorough analysis of business letters, then it makes no sense to ignore these language features. Rather, business letters are a well-defined genre, distinctive conventional genre markers, and it is also a text variety that can be described from a register perspective. Neither perspective is correct. Rather, a complete analysis should cover both while still clearly differentiating between language characteristics that are genre markers and those that are register features. Usually, the general perspective is more easily applied to writer varieties than the spoken varieties, with textual conventions of often clearly identifiable at the beginnings and end of written text. News articles, for example, begins with textual conventions. A headline in a large print, sometimes followed by a subheading in smaller print, and then on the following line, a byline identifying the author and sometimes the location of the reporter. In some cases, textual conventions are found internally in a text from a genre as well as at the beginning and ends. For example, Module 6 discusses how scientific research articles are one of the most conventionalized genres, with conventional textual components that occur in a fixed order. Title and author is abstract introduction, methods, results, discussion, by bibliography. Some spoken varieties can also be approached from a general perspective, which, for example, specific types of prayers and sermons can be analyzed as complete text. And within a particular religious tradition, they can have fixed conventions for the beginnings and endings. Television news broadcasts also often have particular conventions that are used at the beginning and end, and also to structure the transition from one story to the next. Even telephone conversation have genetic conventions. For example, phone calls to a friend in English generally begins with a self-introduction from the caller. Hi, this is Sally, and end with the kind of leave taking. Okay, talk to you later. However, many varieties are less easily described from a general perspective. Even among some writers' text, the role of textual conventions may not be particularly important for distinguishing between varieties. For instance, almost all English language books shares the conventions of beginning with a title page and table of contents, and almost all academic books conclude with an index and bibliography. But beyond that, there are not many distinctive textual conventions that distinguish among the different types of books, fictional, popular, non-fictional, academic, etc. Many spoken varieties are even less easily described with respect to textual conventions. Every conversation is probably the most extreme example. Stereotypically, speakers think of conversation as beginning with conventional greetings. Hi Sam, how are you doing? And ending with a leave taking, see you later. But surprisingly, many everyday conversations do not employ even these minimal conventions. This is especially the case for conversation that we have with people that we see several times a day. In fact, it is often difficult to determine where a conversation begins or ends, especially when the participant enter and leave at different times. Conversation is fluid in this way, consisting of interactions with multiple participants, making it very difficult to even determine what constitutes a complete text. In your own analysis of text, you will need to decide if including some analysis of general markers is useful, depending on whether the variety can be described from a general perspective, and if you can access to complete text. If include general markers are typically identified in one of two ways. Simply by looking at several complete texts, you are likely to see consistent textual conventions. If you are already familiar with the variety, you may already have expectation about where they will occur and the form they will take. Though you should always check your expectation against real text. The other way that general markers may become apparent is when you are analyzing linguistic features for a register analysis. As with the example of deer in letter, you may find that a language feature is not pervasive throughout the text, but rather occur at a particular point in all of the text. In your analysis, you would then identify that language feature as a genre marker rather than a register features. After you identify genre markers, you must also consider whether they are purely conventional or functional. Some text conventions serve important functions. For example, headlines in news reports facilitate reading comprehension, especially for readers who skim the stories. Other textual conventions are arbitrary, purely conventional, representing the general accepted way of structuring a text from a particular genre, but not serving obvious functions. However, many genre markers incorporate both functions and convention. For example, parenthetical references in academic texts are functional, providing support for an author's claim in telling readers where to find that support. But the exact form of the references, whether based on the American Psychological Association or Modern Language Association or another system, is purely conventional. 3.7 Persuasive linguistic features that are not directly functional, the style perspective. Finally, the style perspective incorporates the same kinds of linguistic analysis as the register perspective, a relatively comprehensive analysis of core lexical and grammatical features. See Table 3.4, employing quantitative techniques to describe the extent to which a feature is used. However, the basis of comparison is different from the register and genre perspective. That is, the style perspective is usually used to compare text within a single genre or register, such as comparing novels written by different authors or written in different historical periods. In this case, linguistic differences are not associated functionally with the situational context because all of these texts are produced in similar situation. Rather, the interpretation of linguistic differences has to do with the literary or aesthetic effects created by the different style. For example, there are several major stylistic parameters that distinguish among different types of novels. An authors can choose to narrate a story from the first person perspective of one of the characters or from the third person perspective, usually a person who is not a character in the story but able to observe everything that occurs. Sometimes a story is told mostly through prose description of events and places. In other cases, a story is told mostly through the dialogue of the main characters. Sometimes a third person narrator actually tells us what characters are thinking and feeling. In other cases, a third person narrator can only observe physical action and events like any normal person would be able to do. Choices like this have important implication for the typical linguistic features used in a text, and those features in turn have an important influence on the aesthetic effect that the text has on readers. We discuss such patterns in much more detail in chapter 5 and 8 with respect to methodological considerations. Though the important point in that the linguistic analysis undertaken from the register perspective and the style perspective are essentially the same, but the interpretation of style involves literary or aesthetic consideration rather than direct functional associations to the situational context. 3.8 Embedded registers and genres. In most cases, it is safe to think of the relationship between situation and linguistic form as one directional. Register is determined by the situational and speaker use language forms that functional match the requirements of that situation. However, writers and speakers can also embed one register with another or create a register by deliberately violating the expectation of the situation. For example, the register of conversation is often embedded within news reporting or novel because authors quote people's speech. Genres can also be embedded in a text from a different genre. For example, a novel can contain a letter. A conversation can contain a joke or personal narrative as noted in section 2.2.1. Method section are embedded in the scientific research article. To analyze cases like this, it is necessary to consider the embedded unit as a separate but complete text embedded in a larger text. Thus, this embedded text, a letter, joke, personal narrative, or method section, are complete and have well-defined genre markers such as conventional beginnings and endings, or a conventional rhetorical organization. At the same time, the larger text can often be analyzed as an instance of a different genre with its own conventional genre markers. A different kinds of embedding occurs with register shifts, usually in conversation when the speaker switches to a different linguistic registers. In such cases, the speaker evokes a new situational and a different registers by employing linguistic features typical in a different register. The linguistic form creates the situational rather than vice versa. In other words, the linguistic form is deliberately chosen because it is associated with a particular situational context other than the actual context of the interaction. In this way, the language evokes some aspect of the other situational context. This is usually done for humorous effect. For example, in the following face-to-face conversation, which between two students, Adam switches to the linguistic register of classroom teaching, imitating the language used by his instructor during a lecture. Text sample 3.5 face-to-face conversation. Roger, it was like I was going, yeah, hey, that's really too much. Adam, yeah, switching to a deeper tone of voice. In a sense, it doesn't change the fact of the matter, which is the point you're getting at, which is quite correct. On the other hand, if I think I'm prepped in some deterministic mechanism, I have in effect degraded the notion of aliveness. Roger, yeah, what's that supposed to mean? In these cases, the physical situation remains the same, but the speaker or writer switches to language that has been borrowed from some other linguistic register to evoke the situational characteristic of that register. Such cases can provide interesting register analysis in themselves to describe the communicative effects of these embedded or created link registers. In 3. In 3.9, a short introduction to corpus linguistic. We noted above the quantitative linguistic analysis of registers are often conducted using the methodologies of corpus linguistic. There are several introductory textbooks that introduce this subfield of linguistic. Biber, Conrad, and Repen, 1998, Mac Energy, Xiao, and Tono, 2006. You will find this introduction very useful if you choose to pursue more advanced register studies. According to Biber, Conrad, and Repen 1998 4, the essential characteristics of corpus-based analysis. It is empirical, analyzing the actual patterns of use in natural text. It utilizes a large and principal collection of natural text known as a corpus as the basis for analysis. It makes extensive use of computer for analysis using both automatic and interactive techniques. It depends on both quantitative and qualitative analytic techniques. Several of the advantages of the corpus-based approach come from the use of computers. Computers makes it possible to identify and analyze complex patterns of language use based on consideration of a much larger collection of text than could be dealt with by hand. Furthermore, computers provide consistent, reliable analysis. They don't change their mind or become tired during a register analysis. Taken together, these characteristics result in a scope and reliability of analysis that not otherwise possible. However, it is important to emphasize that the quantitative and computational aspects of corpus analysis do not lessen the need for functional interpretations in register studies. Rather, corpus-based analysis must go beyond simple counts of linguistic features. It is essential to include qualitative functional interpretation of the quantitative patterns discovered in a corpus-based register analysis. In this regard, all register studies follow the same major methodological steps, whether they are corpus-based or not. 3.10 Small scale versus large scale register analysis. The analytic steps described in chapter 2 and 3 are at the heart of all register analysis. The same basic analytical steps are required no matter how large or small a study is, describing situational characteristic, counting linguistic features, interpreting the functional associations between the two, and comparing two or more registers to identify what makes them distinctive. A small-scale study is based on analysis of relatively few texts from a register, and the linguistic analysis are typically carried out without the aid of computers. Most of the activity at the end of each module are designed as small-scale studies. These are investigations that you will be able to complete using only the analytic techniques presented in this course. In contrast, a large-scale comprehensive registers analysis uses the techniques of corpus linguistics. The analysis will be conducted with a principal corpus of text designed to represent the registers with a large number of different texts and lengthy samples that reliably captured both the diversity and similarities among texts in the register. See section 3.3.2. Often, a large number of linguistic features will be included in the analysis, and in most cases, more than two registers will be compared. In addition, larger scale registers analysis often describe the patterns of linguistic variation using statistical techniques. For example, the description of typical linguistic features will focus on the central tendency of each register, usually reporting means scores. A comprehensive analysis will also compare to diversity of features across text within a register, describing how tightly text within the register conform to the central tendency. This aspect of the discussion will mostly present standard deviations, a measure of how tightly clustered or loosely scattered scores are around the mean. Comparisons of the distribution of features in two or more registers may report statistics which show that the differences are unlikely to be due to enhance, although we do not cover the use of statistic analysis for register studies in the present course. You will want to develop proficiency in these techniques if you choose to pursue large-scale register studies later on. Both small-scale and large-scale register analysis are useful. In the following modules of this course, you will be exposed to register analysis of both types. You will read some small-scale case studies following the procedures from the register analysis step by step. For example, in the case study of electronic registers is module 7, but you will also read about the findings from several large-scale register studies in module 9. In many places in the course, we describe the characteristic of register while referring to a single text or a small number of texts in these cases. We have chosen example texts that are typical for the register based on the findings of previous scale register analysis. Similarly, we have chosen the particular text for the module activities so that they are representative of their register, again based on our knowledge of previous large-scale analysis of these registers. However, you should be cautious about generalizations from small-scale analysis, including the module activities. When you base a register description on a small number of texts and short samples, it is important to remember that these results are primarily additional research based on a larger, more representative corpus of text from the register will provide greater confidence in the extent to which a linguistic description is generally accurate.